Hey everyone, Charles Raether, Managing Partner at AmLaw Group with you once again. And welcome to Module 3 of our EB-5 intensive course. In this module, we are going to talk about the regional center and everything kind of related to it. The investment, the regional center, the timing, documentation related to the regional center, and stuff like that. If you missed our earlier two modules, you should be able to access that in the description below. If you can't find it, please reach out to us because you don't want to miss that important information as well. So let's get down right to business. Let's talk about the regional center projects and everything related to that. So let's say you've worked with your attorney and doing the source of funds work and everything's pretty much worked out. You're at the phase of selecting the project. With our clients, we generally advise clients to start looking at the projects, maybe when we think we're about 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks max out from finishing all the source of funds work and the EB-5 work. Because there's not much sense in picking the project first and then doing the EB-5 work, because sometimes there's tight deadlines with the projects when the investors have to be fully invested, the work has to be done, and if there's any delays in doing the paperwork, the investor might not be able to meet that deadline. So usually the process is start working on the source of funds, on the legal work. Once that's kind of more or less under control, then you can start looking at the actual projects in the regional centers. So what do you need to keep in mind when selecting the projects and or regional centers? As I mentioned in our earlier modules of this series, unlike other attorneys, we work with our clients in helping to select projects. We are not financial advisors, and we disclose that immediately. We cannot give you advice related to the profitability or the soundness of the business plan and stuff like that, since we're not construction managers or developers ourselves. But we can look at the projects and the paperwork from an immigration perspective, whether it's in compliance with best practices, whether this is consistent with stuff that we regularly see for EB-5 projects, and whether there's any kind of suspicious or strange terms in there that give us pause and might be of importance to you too. So we don't shy away from that work. We work with our clients in assisting with them within the limits of our abilities, obviously. How does one go about selecting the regional center and a project of theirs? So as I mentioned also in our first module, we generally rely on the regional center. And so I would say we rely and look to the regional centers that we trust. And I'm not saying the regional centers that we work with are the only ones you can trust, but there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. If there's a half dozen of regional centers that we've regularly worked with over the years, we feel secure with them and safe, why go look for other options? Generally between the options at those 5 or 6 regional centers we generally work with, they have more than enough options to address any kind of client's interests and stuff like that. Of course, if a client does have a regional center or a project that they found out on their own, we're more than happy to review it and discuss it with him or her to come to a conclusion about it. But we tend to focus on the regional centers, and then we rely on the regional centers to make the right analysis and decisions and do the due diligence correctly with the developer to make sure that those projects that they are sponsoring are in good standing, likely to be completed as planned, and return the money back to our investors on schedule as well. So that's an advantage of working with AmLaw Group. We will share with you those regional centers that we find to be reasonable and secure and promising and safe to work with, because there's really no sources online or anywhere that can provide that information. Now, then the next step is picking a project. And sometimes some regional centers might have several projects all at the same time. How do you go about picking a project? Well, if you look at the general trends overall last couple of years, rural projects are far and away the most popular right now, right? Probably 85% of all EB-5 investors are going into rural projects. And I don't blame them, and I think it's a sound strategy, especially if you're trying to get your green card as soon as possible. That is the best way to get your green card as soon as possible. We do have clients sometimes that are overseas. They're not in a big rush, and for that reason, they might choose a project in an urban area with high unemployment. What would be the advantage of doing that? Well, this is a broad generalization that might not always be true, but urban projects in high unemployment areas, in order to invest only the $800,000, because if you invest in an urban project that's not in a high unemployment area, you're going to have to pay or invest $1,050,000. So we're all assuming these are all $800,000 projects. The advantage of an urban project in a high unemployment area, or a TEA, is that generally, again, this is a broad generalization, the investment tenure is generally shorter. You can usually get your money back faster than a rural project. Fastest I've seen is 3.5 years. And that seems to be kind of the norm these days, 3.5, 4 years, maybe 5 as well. Rural projects tend to take longer and have a longer investment cycle. And the other advantage or possible advantage of an urban project is that the interest rate or the rate of return is generally higher. Because there is so much demand now for rural projects, it's just pushing down, the margins that they pay to the investors. Again, I understand that for most investors, the income they earn off the investment is not that critical. But again, if all things being equal and there's one deciding factor, and that deciding factor might be the rate of return, in most cases, the rate of return is quite a bit higher than in a rural area. What are we talking about in actual numbers? Well, maybe a rural project might pay 1%, maybe even a little bit less per annum. Urban project and a TEA might pay 2 or 3%. So on paper, it's maybe double or triple what you're going to get, but at the end of the day, might not make a very big difference. What else do you need to look at? One thing I notice a lot of clients ask about is whether the 956F has been approved. So that's the form that the Regional Center files prior to or simultaneous to recruiting investors, where each project has to get pre-approved by the Immigration Service. And the Immigration Service, being a government agency, is not always the fastest, so the Regional Center might file that form, but it might take 2-3 months, maybe longer, to get that approved. In the meantime, the Regional Centers are allowed to recruit investors, but the cases aren't going to be adjudicated. Again, that's not really a problem, because even in a case of a rural project, you're still looking at a 12-month adjudication period. So if it takes them 2, 3, 4 months to review that form, it's not a big deal. Now, some clients are worried that if the Regional Center doesn't have approval of the project yet, that's risky. In theory, that's true. In reality, if you're working with a reliable Regional Center who's done this for years and years and years, you really should not have to worry that much, because they have this down cold. They've been doing this for 10 plus years. They know exactly what the requirements are. So I don't think it's very risky if that form has not been approved when you start making the investment. To just be extra safe and comfortable, sure, you could wait, and I don't belittle anybody for wanting to do that. But if it's a good project and you're very interested in it, and there aren't too many spaces left, I don't think you're taking a big risk by going ahead and investing in the project if the 956 has not yet been approved. So that's just food for thought. Again, each investor has to make a decision for him or herself what they feel most comfortable with. Let's talk about timing as well. And I briefly mentioned with rural projects, the vast majority of people are investing in rural projects. No surprise, because under the new law, rural projects have priority. And that priority means, in reality, they're getting reviewed and approved in about a year, plus or minus 2 months. The government is pretty good, at least at the time of this filming, the government's pretty good at approving these within 12 months of filing. We've had to file mandamuses for a couple clients just because the client was getting antsy. It had been maybe 13 or 14 months. They didn't want to wait any longer, but it wasn't a problem getting that mandamus approved. For urban projects, it's a longer time frame. It's probably 2 to 3 years. And I get the impression that for the majority of officers, they're being thrown at these rural projects to ensure that they get reviewed in time. And the other projects are just getting reviewed to the extent they have manpower available to do that. I could be wrong about that, but that's just my assessment based on the timelines that we're seeing. So given the fast processing for rural projects, I don't begrudge anybody for choosing a rural project. And to be honest, I probably would select one too, just because even though it might have a slightly longer investment cycle, rate of return might be a little bit less, the value of having certainty that more or less your case is going to get reviewed in 12 months is really worth a lot in terms of peace of mind for our clients. After you've had an approval for your initial green card, let's say you did a rural project in a year, it got approved, how long is the wait time after that? Well, that depends on whether you're in the US or outside. So if you're in the US on some other status, Once you get that approval, let's say in 12 months, you file your adjustment of status documents either at that time, or you might have filed them when you filed the 526. What you do is totally up to you. If you have another status that is valid for a period longer than the expected adjudication period for the 526, I would suggest not filing for the adjustment of status, just because you're protecting yourself. God forbid, in the worst case, your EB-5 gets denied, you'll still have your old status to rely on in that case. Whereas if you do file for adjustment of status, and you're one of the very few unlucky ones to get a denial, then you don't have another status to jump back to, because when you file the adjustment of status documents applying for the EAD and the advanced parole, when you file for that stuff, you're basically renouncing the other status that you currently have in the U.S. If you're in a tourist status, then I think almost in every case, you would just go ahead and file the adjustment of status at that time, because there's nothing really that you're losing. If you do get a denial, you could just leave the U.S. and then come back as a tourist again. So that's generally pretty straightforward there. If you're filing from abroad or planning to go through consular processing with your EB-5, that can take longer. It depends on your nationality, the country where you're going through for the interview, how busy it is there, what kind of a wait time there is. I would say from the moment of approval until getting the actual green card in your hands in the US, if you're doing adjustment of status, with current processing times, I would say it's taking maybe 6 to 9 months. If you're going, and it could be longer, if you're going to the embassy for consular processing there, I would say generally, you're looking at from the start of the process, because there's other agencies we have to go through before it gets over to the embassy, and we have no control how quickly they pass it from one entity to the next, and then it goes from another entity, NVC, back over to the embassy. There's just a lot of bureaucracy. I would say generally, you're looking at least a year from your approval until your interview date at an embassy. And that's assuming that you're not going to an embassy in a country that has a very big backlog. And, for example, India traditionally has a large backlog and long lines for immigrant interviews. China as well. But surprisingly, even Canada does. And it just depends on the country. I don't know what it is. I don't think there's a whole lot of Canadians immigrating to the US. But for whatever it is, immigrant visas get processed in Montreal, and boy, it's taken a long time. It's taken over a year, sometimes even 2 years, just to get that interview date in Canada. So a lot depends on the country you're in and where you'd be filing. If you're a Russian investor, for example, because the embassy in Moscow is closed, you have to go to Warsaw, and that's very problematic because they're very harsh in reviewing Russian applicants, for example, in Warsaw. So again, our recommendation as to where to get your green card, either in the US or at the embassy, depends on your current status, what your plans are, and then also if you were to go through a consulate, where would that be, and what delays or problems might exist there. After you've got your initial green card, it's valid for 2 years, and let me tell you, that should be accompanied by a sigh of relief, because once you get that first green card, it's pretty straightforward and generally pretty easy to get your final green card. As long as the project is more or less completed, there's no problems, no scam, no shenanigans that might delay it, or people stealing money, and thank goodness that's generally not the case for any of our projects. Once you go to get the final green card, that's pretty much a straightforward process. We don't work much with the client at that point. We're working primarily with the regional center and the developer to collect the documents proving the investments, the job creation, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result of that, we will then do all the work to get the final permanent green card just before the temporary or conditional green card expires. So that process is pretty straightforward, and we won't go into it into too much detail. But in terms of getting back to the regional center, in terms of timing, like I was saying, which project you're going to invest in and what are the timing really depends on each project. So that's where we sit down with our clients and say, okay, you're looking at this project, here's the projected return time, here's the projected cycle for this project, what do you feel comfortable with? And you have to weigh the pros and cons of all this. Now, of course, you need to invest your your $800,000 before you file with USCIS. In addition, with that $800,000, you generally have to pay an admin fee to the regional center. How much that admin fee is really depends on the center, the project itself. Sometimes they have more flexibility on the project. Sometimes they're willing to give some kind of discounts. That admin fee varies from anywhere from 60 to 70,000, possibly even 80,000. Generally, you can negotiate it down a little bit. Sometimes you can negotiate it down quite a bit. It just depends on the project, what phase they're at in terms of the capital raising process. Are they close to wrapping things up? And if they are, they might, give you more of a discount just that they can finish recruiting all the investors and close up the project and go forward. So that is all something that depends on the project. In addition, obviously, you have the admin fees that we just mentioned with the regional center. You have your legal fees, which yours truly receives for the legal work. And then there's also the government fees. And the government fees obviously are the same for everybody. Just over $12,000 for the initial conditional green card for the family and about $9,000 and some change for the permanent green card. But those are the main fees that would be required. The only other fees that might exist is maybe for translations, depending if you have to do translations from your native language into English. And then also there's some minor fees for actually the issuance of the green card. I think that's $345 and some other small expenses. What about returning the money back to the investor? At what point does that occur, and how do our investors receive their money back? That too depends on the project itself, and even there, plans could change. Generally, the plan is that they generally return all of the funds to all of the investors at the same time. But like I said, plans can change. And how could that change? Well, maybe market conditions change and they're not able to refinance or to sell the object as soon as that they were planning to. And so sometimes they might do a refinance for only half of the amount and they might return only half of the amount to the investors. These things can vary just based on market conditions and specific issues with individual projects. But again, the general norm I would say is generally they return all of the money to all of the investors in one fell swoop based on the exit plan for the project and the investors. As I said, you're not planning to make a large profit here. Any return that they pay, whether it's a 1%, 2%, 3% return, how often they pay that also depends on the project. Some of them pay that only at the end of the whole investment cycle, although that's unusual. Usually it's paid either on a quarterly or annual basis to the investors. So at least you're receiving some income during the course of construction. As for the length of the investment, as I mentioned earlier, the length of the investment, it could be as short as 3.5 years. That's about the shortest we've seen. And it could be as long as maybe 7 or 8 years. Obviously, the shorter ones generally pay a lower return. The ones that require you to have your money invested for a longer period of time would have higher returns. And like there was a project that's being marketed right now in Miami, for example. I think it's about an 8-year return timeline, but they're paying a decent 6% guaranteed per annum rate. So you're getting a good return given that long investment cycle. But I would say average is probably 4 to 5 years, paying about 1 or 2% on that investment. This probably brings us to the end of our third module right now, and we've talked about, again, source of funds, regional centers, and now in our subsequent module, we'll talk about what happens later in terms of getting your money back and what are next steps if you want to pursue next steps after getting your green card, including citizenship. Stay with us for that module, and in fact, there should be a link below that would take you to that. But if you do have an interest in the EB-5 program, or you have questions based on what I said, please feel free to reach out to me individually at the contact information provided below in order to receive an individualized consult for you and your family about your plans.